Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. Okay, today is the 2nd of January 2025. Um, One anecdote first. About a year ago, I was visiting my daughter and her husband, and they were at one point arguing about something or other, what to do, what not to do, something like that. And I heard my daughter saying, I am not telling you what to do. I'm merely suggesting what you should do. Because I'm right. I burst out laughing. This is women's logic, perhaps. Well, my little letter to the Pope, because it's the beginning of the year, and I think I'm not saying what he should do. I'm purely, merely suggesting, okay? I am perfectly aware that I am not St. Catherine of Siena here. But first of all, he looks a little bit tired to me, not surprisingly. He gave a sermon on immigration, which is a recurring theme. There are certain recurrent themes. Another one is Pope Francis things. I mean, please, can you please stop just mentioning Francis? Okay, so there are certain things I want to say to him. Not from hostility. I told you, my followers here, I am not there yet. There are many Catholic channels and many people who think that he's not doing enough, he's not doing things quickly enough, that perhaps that means that he is Francis 2.0, and I'm not there yet. I said at the very beginning, I am aware of what he's not doing quickly enough. I know that. You don't need to remind me of that. But I think that he is being judged a little bit not with enough prudence. And I said from the very beginning, I'm going to wait. There is going to be a congregation of bishops, and now this week, the 6th and the 7th, I will see where I go from there. Okay, so this is about, he keeps talking about immigration. And I have covered this a number of times, saying, things like the things that everybody knows, that you cannot have goodness without justice, and so on. But I'm going to put it all together, okay, since it is the beginning of the year. And I'm going to start with respect and reverence for him and for the office, okay? So I'm going to start being very nice, okay? So this is, I start my letter thus. Most Holy Father, I write with filial respect and gratitude for your unceasing call to charity, mercy, and care for the vulnerable, virtues without which the Church would betray her Lord. Yet charity, when detached from justice, risks becoming sentiment rather than truth. The pastoral word that embraces the poor who arrive at our doors must also reckon with the poor who already dwell within those doors. Peoples marked by, in many cases, despair, loneliness, spiritual erosion, and a sense of dispossession in their own land. Justice, as the Church has always taught, does not hear only one cry, but weighs all cries together. It is in this spirit, not of resistance to mercy, but of fidelity to its full moral depth, that I humbly offer these reflections. My words are, therefore, in the spirit of reinforcing balance in the Church, not hostility towards you, For, as St. Augustine, I had to look it up, said, when speaking of justice as the condition to moral goodness, he says, remove justice, and what are kingdoms but great robberies? I think this is from Civitate Dei. 4:4. Which implies, if I understand him correctly, that moral intention without justice degenerates into harm. As did, I believe, St. Thomas Aquinas, echoing the Fathers and paraphrasing here, justice without mercy is cruelty. But mercy without justice is the mother of dissolution. In other words, mercy, compassion, not based on justice, degenerates very easily into sentimentalism and Goodism. Let me be clear from the outset. This is not an argument against charity. Simply some reflections on your opinion on immigration, which is a recurring opinion. Care for the poor is not optional in Christianity, it is a command. And any church that forgets that has already gone quite a long way to ceasing being Christian. But charity is not a feeling or a sentiment. In the Christian sense, charity is fundamentally a theological virtue and a state of the will, not merely a sentiment or an emotion. It's an abiding quality of the soul developed through persistent effort and God's grace rather than a fleeting mood or impulse. It is more than a feeling. Love, but see to it that you love in the right order. The Doctrina Christiana. Okay, so charity must be ordered in good order, not indiscriminate. Now, as to compassion, because these things get confused sometimes, not by you, I'm sure, but by a lot of people, I think, how they use these words. Compassion is not softness. It is not pity either. Perhaps we have to clarify here. Pity is an emotion. It is a passive feeling of sorrow, perhaps, often involving a sense of distance or superiority. For example, the bourgeois characters in Charles Dickens, the upper classes and the middle classes would feel pity for those poor people down there. That's pity. Normally, a sense of, acknowledged or not, a sense of distance and superiority. That's pity. But compassion is an active virtue rooted in love, or at least true concern for the other, that moves one to share in the suffering of another and take action of whatever sort to alleviate it. That's the difference, I think, between compassion and pity. And between charity and compassion, charity needs discernment and gravity and prudence. Charity, we all know, is the greatest of the theological virtues, But it must be exercised wisely to ensure it achieves its true purpose, the true purpose of which is to foster authentic love and concern and the genuine good for others, and to prevent its misuse and abuse. When charity is stripped of discernment and prudence, it becomes something else entirely. It could even become, and I'm not suggesting by any means that this is your position here, but it could become a posture, a language, a performance that flatters the giver, blinds the institution. Something akin to pity, which is an emotion, as I said, not a virtue. The Church has always understood this. The saints knew the difference very well when charity is true charity and when it is not. But since the last council in the 60s, whose name I don't want to remember, that has so damaged, muddled the Church's teaching in so many ways, it wasn't only the liturgy. The church began accommodating God to humanity instead of leading humanity to God. That's my first charge. It is theological, it is not political. And this was a crucial change. First, a vertical collapse, meaning Christianity is not God made agreeable and comfortable and God made psychologically soothing, nice. It is God who judges, God demands sometimes, in the Old Testament, and in the New Testament, God loves, God forgives, God wounds sometimes, often perhaps before he heals. My point is that this attempt to accommodate God to humans, this accommodation of adapting God to our psychological, mental health needs, meant for the church, among other things, perhaps more important, but it meant also other things more important, but it also meant a clear loss of authority. And loss of authority invites challenge. A church that explains God instead of proclaiming him has already yielded the high ground. It led to a kind of sentimental Christianity. This is my point. I have a beef with this sentimental Christianity. The kind of sentimental Christianity I am challenging here. So I hope I'm clear that I am not opposing charity towards the weak, towards the poor, towards the immigrant. I am opposing sentimentalization, that kind of a weak, pukey understanding of Christianity. I know the phrase is crude, but it is accurate. Sentimentality reduces Christianity to mood, as if Christianity was simply a system of ethics and good behavior, sort of appearance. Sentimentality replaces sacrifice with empathy, not even sympathy. Sentimentality confuses emotional warmth with truth. In a word, it is infantilization, political infantilization disguised as virtue. Now, as for the issue of immigration and this flattening out of what the poor means. Now, because there are people who always judge what one says in a video according to one sentence, I don't want to belabor the point, but my followers and my members know what my background is, and I'm not going to talk about it again. Only to say that I know what poor means, because that is where I come from. All right? I'm not talking about relative poverty. I'm talking about the poverty where you don't know, you have to survive every day. Perhaps the kind of poor that the Pope found in some places in Peru. I'm not talking about relative poverty here, okay? So I just want you to know that I know what the poor mean. I lived it. All right. So one of the great confusions of our time is this flattening out, flattening of the word poor. I have spoken about this before, but I'm going to do it again. Today, it is almost exclusively means material deprivation. But Christianity never understood poverty so narrowly. Christ speaks just as forcefully, perhaps even more forcefully sometimes, about the poor in spirit, about those marked by despair and loneliness and meaninglessness and inner desolation. These forms of poverty now dominate modern life and may very well dominate the societies where immigrants, poor immigrants, are coming to. Yet these forms of poverty, they are strangely absent from the church's public voice when they speak about the poor, as if they were less urgent, less respectable, or less fundable. The modern church speaks of the poor almost exclusively as economically deprived, socially marginalized, materially lacking, but Christianity never meant only this. Christ speaks of the poor in spirit, the despairing, the lonely, the spiritually empty, the nihilistic, the abandoned soul. And these are not the same populations necessarily. Sometimes they don't overlap at all. By collapsing the poor into economic lack alone, the church is adopting secular categories, speaking in NGO language, loses its unique competence. It seems as if half of the gospel has been forgotten here. And in this type of Christianity, encouraged by it used to be called the Judeo-Protestant Alliance, Jesus, the Christ, is endlessly invoked as someone gentle, welcoming, affirming, and he was all this. But he was also severe, no nonsense, firm. There I even use a political terminology, I am sorry, but sometimes even strategic, when necessary. He spoke in parables. Many times he withheld explanations. He avoided premature confrontation. Be wise as serpents, innocent as doves. What do you think he was referring to here? The church has preserved or is preserving the dove and gradually trying to euthanize the serpent part of it. It seems to have forgotten that innocence without wisdom is not holiness. It is needless exposure, perhaps even naivete. So I'm not talking against helping the poor and the immigrant. I am talking against blindness, political blindness also. If you renounce prudence and justice in the name of compassion, then you will lose the ability to protect anyone, including the poor. So, Holy Father, I think you need a, how am I going to say this? I think you need a Richelieu in the Vatican, a Richelieu on your side. I just did a video on him, so he's present in my mind. A Richelieu, strategic political thinker, because you're surrounded by many, I think, perhaps quite a few, as far as I can see, quite a few Judases there. And they get you on the optics sometimes. Blessing a block of eyes. Well, a la Francis. No good. I can imagine it. Perhaps I'm sure it doesn't happen like this, but I can imagine, oh, Holy Father, could you bless this block of ice? Isn't it, water, a creature of God? Of course, sure, yeah. And so you get into this Francis 2.0 business. You see, I don't think you are Francis 2.0. But you have to please stop just pushing it down our throats. I beg you. I have said, as I said, that I'll wait until what comes out of this congregation of bishops. I am aware, and you're looking rather perhaps tired. I am aware you have inherited a difficult, very difficult, bad hand, and 60 years of deviation, really. And they expect you to change everything in the first few months, and things might be much more complicated than they at first appear. I agree with the people who are saying that some changes should nevertheless have already been done. Redress so much injustice against good Catholic priests and good bishops who were, what is the word, counseled by Bergoglio. And also the fact that you have promoted, is that the right word? You have promoted some perverts there to bishops and I don't know, cardinals. You have been promoting people who everyone is scratching their head saying, why? Why are you keeping Bishop Fernandez there next to you? He writes poetry, homosexual poetry. Get rid of him. Send him to Siberia somewhere, please, to do some hard labor. Send him to caring about the marginalized. Send him to Gaza. Oh, perhaps not. Get rid of him. I can't. I can't. Okay. I can't say for sure whether they are perverts or not. And I cannot know for sure at this stage where you are Francis too or not. But, in the words of John Sholto Douglas, the 9th Marquess of Queensberry, father of Lord Alfred Douglas, Lord Alfred Douglas was Oscar Wilde's a young, beautiful male companion. Yeah. And when his father took him to trial and wrote a note, and he said, referring to Wilde, and he misspelled the word in the note, and he called him a sodomite with an M there. This is for Wilde, a sodomite, he wrote. And he was asked during the trial if he could prove it. And he said, in wonderful syntax, he said, I don't know if you are, but you look it. But okay, and that is what many Holy Father are accusing you already. Okay, I mean of being Francis too, not something else. And perhaps that is why you begin to look rather tired. What I'm saying is that you have inherited a difficult situation, a very bad set of cards, a lot of responsibility there. Also, why the German synodal, whatever it is that they call themselves, so much effort in keeping them in the church. It seems that they don't want to be, okay? They don't want to be Catholic. Let them go if they don't want to be. Let them go and, as they usually do, create their own church. It wouldn't be the first time, okay? Or let them join some other Protestant church denomination, okay? If that is what they want. But they want to remain inside the church, eroding the church from within. Enough of that. There might be a few, perhaps more than a few, vipers around you. That's why I still hold that you are not the continuation of Francis, but as a channel, a humble channel in YouTube, I am in a minority, and I am aware of that. So survival and defending oneself is not opposed to sanctity. Sometimes it is a precondition of it. And Richelieu would say, you are governing with the vocabulary of your rivals. And that's a big mistake. Why do I bring in Richelieu? Why does he matter here? Well, an unlikely figure, yes, I know, perhaps even an uncomfortable one. He was a cardinal, yeah? He was more a politician, of course, as we all know, than a shepherd, than a pastor. More a strategist than a saint, for sure. He would not himself claim otherwise. And yet that is precisely why he is useful here, because you are a pastoral leader, Holy Father, but also, and this is where problems might arise, but also the one governing the Catholic Church, which is an institution. Both, and both require different approaches. Oh, no, only one approach. Well, politics exposes what, well, the Catholic Church is an institution. And politics exposes what sentiment conceals. Richelieu forces us to see distinctions that moral language often smooths over. He reminds us that institutions, he was talking about political institutions, of course, as the state, for example, institutions do not necessarily collapse because they lack good intentions, but because they misread the forces acting against them, from outside or from inside. He was a cool cat, Richelieu was. His political realism is necessary for one who has, I think, a pastoral mission, to be sure, but also a governing role. And this is where his realism would become, I think, indispensable. Richelieu never governed by categories of pity or compassion. He governed by careful analysis of actors, that is, of forces that instrumentalized and weaponized compassion. Those who weaponize compassion. And he was obsessed with those forces precisely because they spoke moral language. They fine-tuned moral language ever so fluently. They hide ambition and self-interest and express it and wrap it up in virtuous language. And they move through institutions unopposed because they are unseen. And they weaponize people's moral conscience against themselves, the people themselves. He knew something that the modern church as an institution seems to have forgotten. Compassion is the easiest value to fake. He was obsessed with such actors, not because he despised mercy himself or didn't think that he was important, essential for a Christian life, but because he understood how easily mercy can be turned against the house that shelters it. Compassion and charity that ignores relations of power when you are governor of an institution feeds those who will later dismantle, bring down the house from which the bread came. The church is an institution, and this is institutional protective logic. If the church as an institution were to collapse or weaken to the point of practical non-existence, the poor would certainly lose a protector, the despairing would lose meaning, the lonely would lose a home. So the question is not, are we being kind enough? Perhaps as a pastor, as a shepherd, that's the question. But as a governor of the church, the question is also, will we be strong enough to still be kind tomorrow? This is structural foresight. Institutions that refuse to think in terms of power do not escape power. They simply surrender it to those who have no such scruples. And those people are never sentimental, to be sure. They calculate patiently while the virtues are there congratulating themselves. Talking because infiltration, I don't want a melodrama here, but it has occurred, yes? Every institution of consequence is infiltrated. Every political movement is infiltrated. This is not paranoia, it is history. And the church is no exception. What is new is not infiltration, but blindness to it. A sentimental Christianity cannot detect enemies because it is weak. It fears judgment. It fears suspicion. It fears discrimination. Discernment has been rebranded as something uncharitable. But an institution that cannot distinguish friend from foe will soon be governed by those who can very well and very clearly see who is a friend and who is an enemy a mile off. I want to name something most church discourse avoids. the church has been totally infiltrated by adversarial powers. Richelieu would treat this as an obvious fact. Every powerful institution is infiltrated. The question is whether the institution itself notices it, names it, hides from it, neutralizes it. So, yes, what he writes in his political statement, Richelieu, is a corrective in some form. I know that he was more a politician than a cardinal. But that is precisely why his mode of thinking would be useful to the church. It wouldn't go against it as an institution. He would remind the church, that power exists whether you like it or not. Enemies do not disappear just because you embrace them. Not usually. And silence and reserve are sometimes, for a governor, moral duties. All this talking and all these interviews on planes that Francis used to do. I do not mean always silence when words are necessary. Holy Father, I saw you in Lebanon talking about peace and talking about, excellent peace in Lebanon and Syria, and you forgot Gaza. You didn't mention Gaza. You were not too far away. You were there in Lebanon. So silence, no, not always, but sometimes silence is more prudent than talking, certainly of talking too much. Prudence is necessary here for discerning when to speak and when not to speak, and about what to speak. What is clear is that naivete, real or fake, pretending not to see, is not holiness. Prudence does not replace the gospel, but it protects the conditions under which the gospel can still be preached. So I repeat my two main messages here. My two messages are actually the vertically, the church must stop shrinking God to fit modern man, and horizontally, the church must stop practicing a sentimental politics that blinds it to her adversaries. Both errors arise from the same root, fear of appearing strong. And Richelieu would say those who fear strength will be governed by those who do not. So going back to compassion and the poor and the immigrant, Christianity and the church is not obviously not endangered by compassion. It is endangered by compassion without discernment. Christianity was never meant to be sentimental. It was meant to be salvific. Authority, discernment, silence, and even restraint are not betrayals of the gospel. They are often the means by which the gospel survives hostile terrain. Holiness does not eliminate enemies. It merely changes the reasons they give for opposing you. So I imagine a little dialogue here between Richelieu and the Holy Father. A conversation, okay? So Richelieu would say, Let us begin here. There is something profoundly wrong when the Church no longer leads humanity toward God, but instead adjusts God so that humanity feels comfortable and nice approaching Him. That is not evangelization, that is accommodation. And I imagine that Pope Leo would say, are you saying that the Church has inverted the direction of transcendence? Yes, that's what I'm saying. And once that inversion happens, everything else follows. Authority weakens, language softens, demands disappear, and then compassion becomes indistinguishable from appeasement. But compassion is not optional. The gospel is explicit about care for the poor. Of course. But Christianity has never understood the poor as a single, flattened category. The poor, material deprivation, the immigrant. Christ speaks of the poor in spirit as clearly as he speaks of the poor in possession. Today, the Church speaks almost exclusively of the latter, as if despair, loneliness, spiritual emptiness, nihilism were secondary concerns, or worse, impolite ones. Are you, Richelieu, suggesting that the Church has adopted secular categories? Not adopted, inherited them without discernment. Economic poverty can be measured. Spiritual poverty cannot. And what cannot be measured, it is now easily ignored. But my dear Richelieu, are you attempting to give advice to the Church here? I mean, you were hardly a model of Christian gentleness. Yes, I know, and that is precisely why this conversation matters. I am forcing you to see a distinction that the Church seems to have forgotten. It is this, and it's very simple, the distinction between those who have to endure suffering and the forces that inflict that suffering on them. I couldn't afford to govern by pity alone. I had to govern by analyzing who benefits, who advances, and who destabilizes. And I learned and understood something that remains scandalous to say out loud, that the poor are not the dangerous ones. The dangerous ones are those hidden actors who fake and instrumentalize compassion. That's a little bit too harsh. It sounds harsh only if you confuse clarity with cruelty, and they're not the same. I was never hostile to charity. I was hostile to blindness. I always said, and in my humble opinion, you should listen to my advice carefully. I always said, charity that ignores power relations feeds those who will later dismantle the house from which the bread came. I am talking about structural foresight here. You're implying that compassion can be weaponized? Not can be, is. Compassion is the easiest moral language to counterfeit. It requires no sacrifice. It requires no truth, no conversion, only performance. And institutions that govern by sentiment are transparent to their adversaries. They advertise their weaknesses. So, your concern, I can see, Monsieur Richelieu, is not that the Church helps the poor, but that It no longer discerns how and within what power structures it does so. Exactly. A church that refuses to think in terms of power does not escape power. It merely hands power to those who do think in those terms. And they are never sentimental. A church that makes itself fully legible to the world becomes governable by the world. Not all truth must be spoken now. Not all intentions must be declared publicly. This sounds like an accusation of infiltration. It is an observation, not a conspiracy theory. It is an observation. Every durable institution is infiltrated. The question is whether the institution notices it. Sentimental Christianity cannot notice because it fears judgment, it avoids suspicion, as I have said, and it equates discernment with being uncharitable. And this is how institutions commit suicide while congratulating themselves on their virtue. Yes, but you see, Christianity is not a country. Christianity is not a state. It is not France under siege, as when you were about. No, but it is an institution entrusted with something fragile. Truth does not survive automatically, nor does authority, nor does meaning. Christ himself did not speak everything openly. He sometimes withheld, he sometimes delayed. He spoke in parables. Be wise as serpents. Watch out, innocent as doves. So, what is the warning precisely? The warning is this: when the church reduces Christianity to moral warmth, fussy is no word. Anyway, warmy, moral warmth, it becomes governable by those who have no interest in God at all. When the church speaks endlessly of material poverty and accepting immigration and being kind and very nice, okay, and falls silent about the native population's spiritual desolation, lack of jobs there. To be just, you have to look at both. And if it doesn't do that, it abandons precisely those who are most lost. And when it mistakes naivete for holiness, it invites adversaries to operate freely within its walls. Are you correcting church governance? Yes, exactly that. I want to remind the church of something she once knew. She always knew until the last infiltration in the 60s that survival is not opposed to sanctity and that prudence is not the enemy of love. If the church collapses, the poor lose a refuge, the despairing lose meaning, the lonely lose a home. So the question, as I said, is not, are we compassionate enough? That is not sufficient. An additional question needs to be asked when you have enemies inside and outside the church. And the real question is, will we still exist to be compassionate tomorrow? And if the church refuses to ask that question like that, then others will answer it for her. And they will not answer it kindly. So this is not a rejection of charity. No, it is not. It is a rejection of charity without discernment, of faith without authority, and Christianity without gravity. A hard message. Yes, but Christianity was never meant to be soft. I hope this clarifies things. And what I want is a disciplined spine, not a polite, finished rhetoric. Structure that prevents sentimentality. Holiness does not eliminate enemies, it merely changes the reasons they give for opposing you. And in my last video about Richelieu, I read a fable about the shepherd and the watchman, and I think is appropriate here. So I'm going to read it again, because Christianity does not only speak of shepherds, it also speaks of watchmen. Yeah. If the watchman sees the sword coming and does not blow the trumpet, and that comes from Ezekiel somewhere. Richelieu would argue feeding the poor is shepherding, but anticipating betrayal from those especially perhaps close, the ones who smile too much. That is watchfulness. In other words, the shepherd is, doing pastoral work, but the governor of the institution has to be more of a hawk to watch out. So anticipating betrayal is watchfulness. And ignoring threats is moral negligence, not virtue. When you are a governor of the island, of the institution, and a pope who sees only sheep will misread wolves disguised as sheep. A church that renounces power in practice while retaining responsibility in theory and practice is courting disaster. Holiness does not exempt one from enemies, it merely changes the reasons they give for sharpening their blades. And that is something that the church rarely wants to hear, and often needs to. So, my most holy Father, let me read the shepherd and the watchman, and then I'll finalize it. There was once a walled city whose ruler was both shepherd and king. By day he walked among the people with open hands. He fed the hungry, listened to grievances, and spoke plainly so that none might mistake his heart. The people loved him for it and said, "See how transparent he is. Nothing dark lives in him." On the outer tower stood an old watchman, dressed in red, who rarely descended into the square. He spoke little, listened much, and kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. When the shepherd spoke of mercy, the watchman said nothing. When the gates were opened wider, the watchman tightened his grip on the bell rope. One evening, the shepherd said to him, "Why did you never come down to the people? Why did you hide behind the stone and shadow?" And the watchman answered, "Because the city already knows your face, but it does not yet know its enemies." And the shepherd replied, "I trust the flock. If I rule by fear or concealment, I will become what I resist." And the watchman said, "If you rule by visibility alone, you will teach the wolves where you sleep and when." At dawn, travelers arrive at the gates, some hungry, some flattering, some bearing gifts. The shepherd welcomed them all, for his duty was charity. The watchman nevertheless saw among them men who were counting walls, others who were whispering, and others who smiled too quickly, and so he rang no bell. Instead, he altered the guard's routes. He delayed answers. He spoke one thing to them and then prepared another. And the people noticed that and murmured, "Why does the watchman speak crookedly? Why does he not say the truth, what he means?" And the shepherd confronted him. "Your silence breeds suspicion. Truth must not be bent." The watchman replied, "Truth is heavy. If dropped all at once, it breaks the floor it stands on." That winter, an attempted seizure of the gates failed. The city nevertheless survived, and the people praised the shepherd's compassion and distrusted the watchman more than ever. Years later, when the watchman died, the shepherd inherited the tower. Only then did he see how many roads led to the walls, how many faces rehearsed innocence, and how often mercy had been studied by those who did not feel it at all. And the shepherd wept, not because the watchman had lied, but because he had been right. And the moral of the story is that a city can be loved to death or can be loved into danger. And a watchman can save what he's never thankful protecting. Or St. Gregory the Great said, "A ruler must so temper justice with mercy that neither severity crushes nor compassion dissolves," which is, I think, directly relevant to leadership and moral discernment. And so, let me just so my conclusion. Most Holy Father, the Church's authority has never rested on moral urgency alone, but on moral proportion, on the hard wisdom that refuses false simplicities. When goodness is separated from justice, it softens into feeling. When justice is separated from truth, it hardens into ideology. Our tradition asks more of us: to love without illusion, to welcome without blindness, and to judge without hatred. And in recalling this balance, I do not seek to diminish the gospel's demands, but to protect it from becoming unmoored from the very human reality it was given to redeem. May the Church continue to be a mother to the stranger and a home to her own children, without asking either to vanish so that the other may live. Dum spiro espero. Thank you.